Great. Thank you all so much for bearing with us. All right, again, welcome everyone to the California Advancing PREA office hours, supporting incarcerated survivors during forensic exams and investigatory interviews, presented by Just Detention International and Valor. We're so glad you're all able to join us today. And we'd like to go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Layla Dost. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a program officer with Just Detention International and a member of JDI's Survivor Council. I'm also a former Rape Crisis Center advocate, and I will pass over to Jenica.
All right. Hi, folks. Again, thank you for the patience with technical difficulties. We are all settled in now. My name is Jenica Sinor. Pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm a project coordinator here at Valor.
Thank you, Jenica. And again, if you want to introduce yourselves like folks are doing in the chat with your name, pronouns, agency, and role, please feel free to do so we can get a sense of who's here with us today.
So I'm here at Valor US, or Valor, formerly the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or CALPASA, is committed to preventing and ending sexual violence by advancing equity and eradicating oppression. We provide vision, resources, leadership to rape crisis centers, individuals, and other entities committed to ending sexual violence. Ultimately, what we hear at Valor envision is a world free from violence, where the dignity of every person is valued and respected.
And Just Detention International, or JDI, is a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention. JDI's core goals are to work together with corrections officials, rape crisis centers, and policymakers to make detention facilities safe, change public attitudes about sexual abuse behind bars, and ensure that survivors get the help that they need. And it is our fundamental belief that when the government takes away someone's freedom, it takes on an absolute responsibility to protect that person's safety. No matter what crime someone has committed, rape is not part of the penalty. Now in its 7th year, the California Office of Emergency Services, or CalOES, funded California Advancing PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act, project allows Valor and JDI to partner in offering support and guidance to California rape crisis centers on how to build strong relationships with California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, county jails, and juvenile facility staff. We provide guidance on how to create sustainable agreements for the provision of victim services to survivors. Although much progress has been made, we understand that there continues to be a gap and challenges in the services available to survivors behind bars. In today's session, we will go over the investigatory process and considerations when supporting incarcerated survivors. We'll explore steps and strategies RCC advocates can use before, during, and after an investigatory interview or forensic exam to support incarcerated survivors. We'll also discuss some common scenarios and approaches to advocate for incarcerated survivors during accompaniments. And I'm sure many of you joining us today are well aware of your role in supporting survivors as an advocate. The work that you already do translates to supporting incarcerated survivors with some specific considerations. Providing emotional support is central to your role. And when providing accompaniment to incarcerated survivors during medical exams or investigatory interviews, your presence in correction settings can make a difference, helping the survivor feel less alone and that someone is really there showing up for them in a difficult time. Your main role as an advocate is to believe the survivor and to remind them that they are not at fault for what happened. This is especially important for someone who is incarcerated, as there is often an added layer of blame or acceptance towards sexual violence behind bars. Just as when accompanying survivors in the greater community, you're there to advocate for the incarcerated survivor as needed, using your discernment and understanding of your relationship with the corrections agency you're working with. We'll explore this with greater detail shortly. As with any survivor, you want to explain the limits of your confidentiality. You may be a mandated reporter and need to disclose certain information, and always defer to your agency protocol and the expectation of your agency's MOU when doing so. And of course, you want to ensure that the incarcerated survivor you're working with will be able to access follow-up support services from your agency. And this can look different from when we're working with survivors out of custody, given the limitations on communication and movement within facilities. Let the incarcerated survivor you supported during accompaniment know that your agency will be an ongoing resource for their support, and we'll be exploring all of this in more depth shortly. We really want to stress that each accompaniment is unique, and variables beyond your control may impact your approach to advocacy. It's best to be discerning in the advocacy you provide, reading the room, noting tension, tone, and the body language of staff present, the emotional response of the survivor, and relying on your relationship with the facility and past experiences of advocacy. We can always keep best case scenarios in mind, such as advocating that restraints be removed from an incarcerated survivor who poses no threat as a trauma-informed practice, and adjust from there. Tune into the situation at hand, engage when to push and when to pull. Remain professional, refer to your knowledge of PREA and the rights of survivors under California law, and your MOU with the facility if needed. Know when to yield. Be mindful of how your interactions may impact your agency's relationship with the facility. And above all, keep the safety and well-being of the incarcerated survivor in mind. You get to leave the facility at the end of the day, and they do not. Before we begin accompanying incarcerated survivors, we want to be sure to examine any biases we may have towards incarcerated people. In media, we're often led to believe that all incarcerated people are violent, dangerous, and manipulative. Few of us are educated on the reality that most incarcerated people have been abused themselves prior to incarceration. We have heard concerns from facilities about survivors who may act out during forensic exams or use the exam as an excuse to leave facilities. Although this may be possible, it's important to remember that survivors outside of custody may also behave disruptively and also take desperate actions to get their needs met. It's important that as advocates, we keep in mind how trauma, both from sexual abuse and just from being in a corrections facility, may impact the emotional responses of the incarcerated survivors we work with. At the end of the day, we as advocates want to be prepared to support all survivors in our service area, including those in jails, prisons, juvenile detention, or immigration detention. Finally, we want to be prepared for challenges in providing accompaniments. We often hear that advocates are not being called for accompaniments on exams, and especially investigatory interviews, or that correction staff are not offering survivors the option of calling advocates. We have also heard of survivors denying accompaniment services to later learn it wasn't made clear to them what an advocate can do. This is an opportunity for relationship building with the facilities that you serve. It's important that you communicate about services directly with the facility and with the population to ensure that everyone is clear about the kind of services you provide. Other challenges may include detention staff violating professional boundaries by asking you to provide input on the investigation, or staff promoting victim-blaming attitudes. Additionally, incarcerated survivors may struggle to trust you as an advocate, having had their trust violated by institutions and support service providers. The benefits that support services provide to survivors cannot be emphasized enough. Access to support helps survivors process and understand the sexual abuse they have experienced, including past abuse, and deal with its impact. This can help reduce the trauma responses of incarcerated survivors, decreasing disruptive behaviors, which may lead to disciplinary infractions, and improving overall mental health. When building relationships with corrections, we often advise rape crisis centers to stress that their services will help improve overall safety at the facility because of the positive impacts of emotional support and advocacy. These benefits continue to accrue even after someone is released from custody. In the preamble to the PREA standards, the Department of Justice recognized that incarcerated survivors who receive proper support services will enhance their ability to reintegrate into the community and maintain stable employment upon their release from prison. And that's also a powerful reminder that incarcerated survivors and incarcerated people as a whole are members of our communities and will be returning to our communities after release. Our support as advocates can help make a difference in their lives as they address longstanding trauma around sexual abuse, as well as recent trauma, giving them the emotional support, resources, and tools that they can carry into their lives moving forward. We can make a difference in their lives and support their success. And I will pass back over to Jenica.
Thank you, Layla. I feel like every time you go through your slides, I feel like I pull like one or two things different than I did in the time before. So just thank you so much. So we're going to go over a brief, overview of the investigatory process as a whole from beginning to end in a detention facility. There's a lot of similarities between the investigation process, but there's also some key kind of differences. So initially, the disclosure or a report, this is when a survivor shares with someone that they've been assaulted. The PREA standards say that survivors have to have 3 ways that they can report. Directly to any staff or volunteer at the facility, to a loved one or a friend or someone on the outside that can report on their behalf, and then to a third-party reporting agency like an ombudsperson or it's Crime Stoppers in some areas or some other pre-designated agency that can receive that report on the survivor's behalf and then reach out to the facility. The survivors should not be filing a report directly to a rape crisis center or an RCC. This can sometimes be confusing, and detention facilities can sometimes think that the rape crisis center is also the third-party reporting agency, and that's not the case. So after that initial disclosure happens, you'll have a staff response, and once staff is aware of someone being assaulted, they may make some initial decisions to separate folks. We've heard survivors getting placed in ADSEG for their safety, quote unquote. But a staff member will be, responding and talking with the survivor, kind of getting a sense of what happened. They may ask a few questions. They may ask a ton of questions. It really depends on the facility and the process, and staff training, staff bias. What we hear a lot in this process is that this is where a pause or a bottleneck happens, where okay, I filed a report and like nothing's happened. Nobody's come to talk with me. Nobody's come to see me. And if staff or if a facility maybe has a reputation of not taking sexual violence seriously, or not responding to reports in a timely manner, it's not uncommon. But ideally, staff response, someone is coming to see the person that's reporting sexual violence. They're asking them some questions to help determine whether a forensic exam is needed. It's not like it's not always like a full long investigatory interview. Sometimes it's just a few short questions. And then after that, there is oftentimes survivors are brought to medical or psychiatric staff to be just kind of assessed and have like an initial assessment. They may do an initial assessment of injuries, anything that might be like urgently tended to, may assess someone's mental health. before a forensic examiner or SART nurse or SANE nurse is involved. And then they go into the forensic exam if that's part of the disclosure. I'm not part of the disclosure. If a forensic exam happens, so if it's sexual harassment and there wasn't, physical touch or physical assault, sexual assault, that requires swabs being taken, a forensic exam may not happen. But the forensic exam, this is honestly the part that most advocates will be familiar with. And oftentimes when advocates are first involved in the process, survivors undergo a forensic exam by a SANE or SART nurse who is specifically trained to do these types of forensic exams. Depending on the circumstances of the assault, this ideally happens as soon as possible, but can also happen up to 5 days after the assault. Again, just depending on the circumstances. And then once that forensic exam is over, an investigation will happen, and that can take a long time. That can be a really frustrating time. This is where a lot of survivors report being really frustrated for not getting any updates and still seeing their abuser. This is where we will, may need to advocate to be available for someone during an investigatory interview, which we'll talk a little bit more about. This is where investigators will look into the details and gather more information. And again, I say that in best case scenario, we'll talk more about, how many cases are substantiated or unfounded. And we'll, talk more about that. And then a determination is made. So once it's determined that the investigation is over, it's determined that the case is either substantiated, meaning the investigation concluded that sexual assault did happen. It's unfounded, meaning it did not happen, or it's unsubstantiated, which means there's insufficient evidence. Sorry, 1 second. So I'm going to drop a couple things in the chat here. The first one is the National Protocol for Sexual Assault Medical Forensic Examinations. It is a kind of lengthy manual. It has a lot more information than our overview is going to go. And then, I just wanted to share that for folks. So please feel free to take that. Okay. We'll talk a little bit about the forensic exam. So forensic interview. I'm sorry, let me pause here for a second. Actually, sorry, forensic interview is where the examiner, so the SANE or SART nurse, asks a lot of yes or no questions to help guide how the exam is going to go. So helps guide, it'll be, talking about what body part touched what body part. Did this touch this? Did this happen? Did this happen? And it helps them determine what kind of swabs need to be taken, what kind of photos need to be taken, so that, if Z didn't happen, we're not going to do an exam that caters to Z happening. And so, one of the worst things you can do after someone's been sexually assaulted is make them go through physical exams that they don't need. So, of course, there's judgment calls that an examiner can make, especially knowing that trauma can impact our memory and impact our ability to remember what happened. So there's judgment calls that can be made, but that forensic interview kind of guides where the exam will go and how it will go. And then the physical exam happens. So the examiner will take photos, take swabs of certain areas. They'll maybe ask follow-up questions. They may write details about certain scratches or scrapes or anything that's happening, or that's visibly present on the body. And then the survivor at all points ideally is being checked in with, is being said, okay, how are you feeling? Do you want to take a pause? This is where advocates can also chime in and say, would you like to take a break? How are you feeling? Do you want to go through with this part? Do you want to go through with this part? In a best case scenario, the client, the survivor is reminded multiple times throughout the process that they can pause at any time, or they can stop at any time, or they can opt out of the exam at any time. And then after the physical portion of the exam is done, and the advocate is left and the survivor has left, and the examiner hangs back at the office or the hospital and writes a report. It typically takes, they'll do an initial couple hours to write a report that will describe what they observed. So, it means there were cuts on this part of the body, there were bruises on this part of the body, X, Y, and Z. And then they will coordinate with law enforcement or, the investigatory entity to get evidence, to get, the kits collected and get those reports put together. And then just an overview of investigatory interviews. So I think Layla touched on this earlier. It's performed by the PREA compliance manager or the investigative services unit. If it's a local county jail, it could be done by your sheriff's department. It really, really depends on where you're at. It's ideally, I say this ideally, it's ideally done in a confidential space. So maybe it's done in an office, or it's done in a classroom that is, empty and isn't really visible for a lot of folks. Maybe there are, lawyers' meeting rooms that can be utilized. Ideally, it's in a confidential space as possible. That's not always the case. We hear oftentimes that folks are just interviewed out in the open in the gymnasium, or are in spaces where there's, staff going in and out. And it really can impact the ability for the survivor to really feel comfortable sharing what happened and feel comfortable going through the details of what they went through. Investigatory interviews are, just pause for a second. Survivors have a right to an advocate just as they would if they weren't incarcerated. And, they have a right to an advocate during, before, and after that investigatory interview. Ideally, we are setting up procedures so that we get dispatched to be part of those accompaniments and those investigatory interviews. We hear a lot from advocates that that's not the case, but we're hoping that changes. We're seeing little bits and pieces of that change over time, but still have a long way to go. And then this diagram here really highlights some of the differences between what an incarcerated survivor can experience during a forensic exam, after a forensic exam, in the overall process of the sexual assault investigation process. And then in the orange side here is someone that's, outside of a detention facility, someone who's not incarcerated. And so, the highlights in that way. But I really want to focus on the gray in the middle here, because I really feel like it highlights the similarities. I think sometimes we hear from folks that, I'm not sure how to support an incarcerated survivor. I'm not sure how to, do the best that I can, or what if I say the wrong thing? And this gray section here really highlights some of the similarities in the process. So, survivors will experience a range of emotions during a forensic exam. It could be that someone is really chatty and wants to make jokes. It could be that someone is really quiet and would prefer not to talk a whole lot. It could be someone's like highly emotional and really needs that emotional support. Both incarcerated survivors and folks that are not incarcerated have a right to an advocate. The exam is performed by a sane and SART nurse. They receive that same quality of service. Both incarcerated survivors and not incarcerated survivors have to oftentimes surrender their clothing. And even more so, that can be really devastating for incarcerated folks. If someone only has a few sets of clothing and you have to surrender the one that fits really well, that you feel good in, you feel confident in, that can be really devastating. It's like salt in the wound. It's pretty awful. both survivors, both types of survivors, there's a lack of updates. It's really difficult to get information. It's really difficult to receive those updates as the investigation's going. If, you know, there's a lack of transparency as the investigation goes forward. And then statistically, we know that justice isn't always reached. Justice isn't served. It doesn't result in a trial oftentimes. It doesn't result in, it doesn't result in justice. And then both incarcerated survivors and not incarcerated survivors experience victim blame. They experience stigma and in different ways a lot of times. And, you know, I'd say for incarcerated survivors, probably even more so and even more severe in a lot of instances, but both experience that victim blame and that stigma. And back to Leila.
Thank you so much, Jenica. Thank you for all of that information. Now we will explore some key steps and strategies to utilize during investigatory interview and forensic exam accompaniments. Ideally, we want to have protocol in place prior to when a forensic exam or investigatory interview happens. This looks like having an MOU in place with the facility and being aware of the facility's procedure in responding to exams or interviews. This means knowing which hospital the facility you are working with will be taking survivors, or whether forensic exams will be performed on site. How are investigatory interviews conducted? Which staff typically conduct interviews? All information that ideally you would get an idea of ahead of time. We also want to ensure our agency and advocates are prepared for accompaniments. Is there a designated advocate at your agency who has clearance for facilities, or does everyone have the clearance and training needed, such as TB tests, tuberculosis tests, background checks, facility volunteer orientations, or other trainings? If an incarcerated survivor has language or interpretation needs, does your agency have staff or outside interpreters available who can provide interpretation? And most importantly, are advocates prepared to work with incarcerated survivors? When accompanying for a forensic exam, it's best to clarify your role with forensic examiners ahead of time, that you'll be there to support the survivor. You will not be present for the perpetrator's exam. When you're called for the accompaniment, ask for the direct cell phone number of the correction staff who will be present. Do your best to know who your contacts are, where you will be going in the hospital or facility, and how you will get into the room. You may already have a relationship with the hospital's SANE nurse or other medical staff, so coordinate with them as needed. Do you have the survivor's name and information? Will you be able to ask for the survivor's name when you arrive at reception? Get the details that you'll need to be able to be present and provide support. If you're bringing materials to provide to the survivor, such as agency literature or resources, get clearance for those items ahead of time. Know what items the survivor would be allowed to bring back to the facility. Similarly, if you're going into the facility, find out what you can take in with you and give to incarcerated survivors. Also be aware of any dress codes and other regulations you may need to know when entering a correctional facility. Before the forensic exam or investigatory interview begins, introduce yourself and your role to everyone in the room. Just like with survivors in the community, you'll want to explain to the survivor who you are and your role. Even if someone has already explained your role to the survivor, it is always best if you do it yourself. You can also let the survivor know that your organization is separate from the facility, and you'll want to be very clear about the limits on your confidentiality. Also, be sure to ask the incarcerated survivor for their preferred name and pronouns, and ask how they would like you to correct others regarding their name and pronouns during the exam and interview. If possible, ask to meet with the survivor for a few minutes before to provide information about your agency's services and get a consent or release of information form signed. This is also an opportunity to build some rapport. As always, let the survivor know that you can be there for the entirety of the exam or interview, or just pieces of it, or that you can wait to talk to them until it is over. Remind them that they are in control. It's best practice that even if the survivor does not want you in the exam room during the exam, that you are nearby in case they change their mind, so you can check in with them when the exam is over. Take time to explain to the survivor that they have the right to refuse any part of the forensic exam. They also have the right not to answer any investigatory interview questions they do not want to. You may also want to explain what may happen during the exam or interview without any guarantee of outcomes or over-explanation. You can help the survivor understand the investigative and reporting process, but ultimately we want medical or corrections staff to provide a detailed explanation of the process and refer questions you do not have the answers to back to these professionals. It's also really important to keep in mind how we as advocates position ourselves in the space we are in. It's best practice to seat ourselves next to the incarcerated survivor whenever possible. So during forensic exams, ask the survivor if they would like you to be at their side and arrange to have a chair placed next to the exam bed. During investigatory interviews, the incarcerated survivor will most likely be sitting across from the investigating staff member. Again, you are there for the survivor and you want to take a seat next to the survivor and be available as a resource to them. Also keep aware that your body language and how you present yourself in these situations can have an impact. If you arrive and you are visibly uncomfortable, keeping a distance from the survivor or keeping your arms crossed, etc., it may send the message that you do not want to be present in that space and are unavailable to provide support. With clients who are incarcerated, we sometimes have to be creative to create a sense of privacy and maintain confidentiality. During a forensic exam, it is likely that at least one officer will have to remain within eyesight of the survivor. This means you do not have the same level of privacy that you normally do. That being said, your conversations with survivors are confidential. What a survivor shares with you, excluding child abuse or imminent threat to self or others, is protected information and should not be shared without a release of information. As mentioned, your main role is to provide emotional support to the incarcerated survivor. And as Jenica mentioned, emotionally, survivors may show up to forensic exams in a variety of ways. They may be quiet and closed off, chatty, making jokes. They might be distressed or frustrated. You can use your judgment to gauge how to respond and offer support. You can also be direct and ask them what kind of support might be most helpful. Do they want them to stay next to you? Do they want you to wait outside? Do they want you to talk with them, or would they like you to just sit quietly? Do they want hand holding or touch or no contact? You can also let them know it's okay and quite common for survivors not to know what they need in the moment and that their needs might change. Check in with the survivor periodically, ask how they're feeling, and remind them that you are here for them. Do your best to keep attuned to the survivor. If the survivor appears to be getting increasingly distressed and agitated or is exhausted and struggling to respond, be sure to ask if the survivor can take breaks during the forensic exam or interview as needed. And you can also provide tangible support, such as asking the survivor if they would like a blanket, a snack, or something to drink. Like with all survivors during the exam or interview, the more power you can give someone over their decisions, the better. When someone is incarcerated, there may be more pressure from a nurse or officer for that person to do or not do certain parts of an exam or give pieces of information in an interview. There is no reason a survivor should ever be forced to do any piece of the exam or interview they are not comfortable with, and it is important that you remind them of this and help advocate for them if anyone is pushing them to do parts of the exam or interview they do not want to do. As always in our work, it's vital that we maintain professional boundaries and remain grounded in our role as advocates, not extending outside of our role or breaking confidentiality during accompaniment. This means we do not align ourselves with investigating corrections staff or provide information about the survivor or things the survivor has disclosed to us to corrections staff. We also do not tell the survivor what to say or try to shift the interview one way or another. Of course, as mentioned, we can remind the survivor of their rights and that they do not have to answer questions they do not want to. We should also maintain boundaries with the incarcerated survivor we're accompanying. They may be asking us prying questions about our personal lives. We can always redirect the conversation back to them and remind them that we're here to support them, not talk about ourselves. You can also ask incarcerated survivors during exams or interviews if they understand the questions being asked and help explain if staff use unfamiliar legal or medical terminology, terms like oral copulation or sodomy. You may also need to manage expectations of the survivor. The survivor may be looking to you to intervene beyond your capacity, provide resources beyond the scope of your work, or may have unrealistic expectations about the outcomes of an investigation. Remind them of your role as an advocate and do not make unrealistic promises about what you or your agency can do. And like with all survivors, the impacts of sexual abuse trauma may take various forms, including emotional or disruptive behaviors. Rely on your experience as advocates to provide emotional support and coping skills to the incarcerated survivor. You are more likely to be able to provide a trauma-informed approach than the corrections staff present. Do your best to normalize trauma responses and big feelings and give the incarcerated person space to process. As we mentioned earlier, advocacy requires your discernment in when and how to interject during a forensic exam or investigatory interview. Even when we're having a positive interaction with a survivor, sometimes officers or others will say things that we do not agree with or are problematic. It's always important to be professional and maintain relationships with facility staff, but we also want to step up and make sure that any problematic language is addressed. It's ultimately up to you to decide how and when you will advocate. Remember the incarcerated survivor's rights and your training as an advocate and do your best. Your presence alone as a professional not affiliated with corrections can make a difference. So you can leverage your role and relationship with the facility to make sure the survivor's rights are upheld and that their needs are being met. Sometimes staff might try to invalidate a survivor's story. Remember that you are not an investigator and you are there for the survivor. You can always remember that staff person about your role. Just like it's necessary to educate your advocates on working with incarcerated survivors, the officers may need additional training on being trauma-informed and may also benefit from training. While it's not appropriate during an exam to give this sort of in-depth education, you may have to interrupt problematic or blaming language. And again, ideally, we want incarcerated survivors to be able to have handcuffs, waist chains, and leg restraints removed during forensic exams. Not all correction staff will be open to this idea. Assess the survivor's behavior and the receptivity of correction staff as you advocate for the removal of restraints. Remind staff that the incarcerated survivor is very vulnerable at this time and does not provide a safety risk, and that staff are doing a good job of keeping an eye on things. Again, everything should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And just because one corrections officer approved removal of shackles and waist chains during one accompaniment does not mean another officer will approve the same thing. Even if staff are not receptive to this, you may be planting seeds for future advocacy efforts and discussion on future meetings with corrections staff. And then at the close of the interview or exam, offer follow-up services for the survivor and provide agency literature or information. Remind the survivor that you and your agency are there to support them and they do not have to deal with their feelings on their own. It's important to share with the incarcerated survivor all the different ways they can stay in contact with your center to continue to receive care and services even after the exam or interview is over. A goal is for you to have developed good rapport with the survivor that they would like to continue to receive services. You will want to make sure that the survivor knows that when they're back at the facility, they can call your hotline and how they can do so, and with that they can access your services with a level of confidentiality, and that those calls are set up to be confidential and unmonitored. You can also let them know they can reach your center by writing and provide the mailing address before you leave. If you offer in-person services, be sure to let the survivor know that that can be set up and how that can be set up, and a timeline on which they can expect someone to see them. If the survivor does want follow-up, ask them to sign an informed consent or release of information, or ROI, which will allow you to write a follow-up letter directly to them or advocate on their behalf. As setting up these services or writing to someone releases that person's information to the facility, it is vital to get their permission to do so, and an ROI would help with that. When filling out an ROI with the client, make sure you explain why you are completing the form and what it means. Offer to read the ROI aloud and summarize what it says for the client, especially as many ROIs are written in legal language that can be difficult to understand. After an exam, a survivor may ask to follow up with a doctor for further medication or testing. I'm sorry, I'm going to gloss over this a little bit. Under PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, they should be allowed medical care for free post-assault. Be prepared to advocate with the facility if the survivor is not receiving the care that they need. And of course, as you depart the exam or interview room, be sure to thank all the staff who are present. Depending on the situation, you may also want to debrief with the corrections staff regarding the ways the incarcerated survivor can access your agency for follow-up services, or to coordinate the provision of services the survivor requested. And I will pass back over to Jenica.
Awesome. Thank you, Layla. So this next section, we're going to go over some different scenarios and talk a little bit about how to approach them. So we'll read the scenarios, and then if you'd like to chime in with key takeaways, or as an advocate, I would do this, or what's really important to make sure that you focus on as an advocate in this scenario. I think maybe chiming into the chat, or using the hand raising feature and then we can like have you unmute. Yeah, we'll go from there. Okay, so let's see. This first scenario, when you arrive at the hospital, you introduce yourself to the survivor, the forensic examiner, and detention staff. The examiner begins to discuss the forensic exam process, but nobody leaves the room. You provide support during the exam, and when it's over, the survivor is visibly upset but trying to hold it together. They thank you so much for everything, and they share that they really want to stay in contact. Yeah, so yeah, in the chat if you'd like, or if you want to share out loud with the group, use the hand raising feature there. What are some key things that you want to make sure you do in this scenario? Yeah, I see Kendall in the chat saying describe limitations for staying in contact. Make sure to sign an ROI for being able to contact them for follow-up. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. see. And I think Judy, it looks like you've unmuted. Go for it.
Okay, I'm not sure, so please bear with me. The first part was that after you introduce yourself, to everyone in the room, I do want to let the individual know at that time, their rights on what they can do as far as stop with any sign or any minutes of the group. Also, there's a part that it was being not to take place, that they have that option of doing that. And also what I'm there for. I'm there for the moral support and to watch the visitors and also to see or to confirm that the individual would like to stay in the room. I need to get the consent. I want to make sure that the individual is comfortable with me. Okay, so my goal is what they want, what they want, and let's say that they want, to stay in the room. One thing that I will advise, and I'm not sure how to do this yet, but I will advise that because of safety protocols, there will be things that I can and cannot do. So please, if I say that is not, or I cannot do that at this time, please accept
Sure.
that, but no, it's for safety reasons only. I want this individual to feel comfortable because they just experienced, they just experienced a traumatic incident. So
Yeah.
that's what I want to
Okay,
do.
Judy. Yeah. I mean, I'm gonna stop right there because there's a lot of background noise, but I think I got like the gist of a lot of what you were saying.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Let's see. So yeah, a lot of what Judy was saying was really making sure to explain the rights that the survivor has during this exam and the rights that they have, before, during, and after, and making sure that's really crystal clear. And if the person has any questions about what that process is like, or about the, exam as a whole, making sure to answer that. And then being really clear about the boundaries within their role of what they can do, what they can't do, and having a discussion when it's appropriate of what your role as an advocate is. I think generally the gist of that, and then it sounds like maybe you were talking about also explaining to the staff maybe what your role is and why it's important and that component. And yeah, I think all of those are really great. In a best case scenario, when you have time to do all of that, or if you can carve out time to do that. Yeah, thank you, Judy. Let's see, I see also in the chat here Heather saying setting up a concrete time for a follow-up if possible, reminding them that we are confidential. Yeah, I think that's ideal. I think sometimes in with detention facilities, if there's a lockdown or if you're sick or if there's a lot of different things can happen that can really impact a best case scenario is definitely to provide I'm going to be there Tuesday at 2 p.m. but also maybe I'm going to follow up later this week, or I'm going to follow up, it depends on your relationship with the facility too. If you are just now establishing a relationship with a detention facility, then it might be something where you leave it a little bit more open-ended. Or if you have a really great relationship and you can say, definitely you'll be there at 2 and that it's not going to be an issue, then I think that's totally appropriate. I really just want to highlight, hi Kay. Would it be appropriate if I asked the detention staff if they need to stay during the exam, trying to assure more privacy during the exam? Yes, thank you for highlighting that. It's definitely one of the key takeaways from this scenario is nobody left the room and it was just kind of commonplace, and it's your role as an advocate to be like, hey, wait a minute, can we get some more privacy, please? And stepping up. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. Okay, we're gonna go on to scenario 2 because I see we're getting closer and closer to our end time. Well, Layla, did you want to do this one or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So while you're waiting outside the exam room for the survivor to change, detention staff strikes up a conversation with you about how the survivor has filed multiple reports before and how they have a history of lying about things. Later on, when you're providing services and discussing follow-up care, the staff knocks on the door and abruptly tries to rush you and the survivor along. You remember that during downtime earlier on, the staff said that they didn't want to be here too long, that they had things to do after work. What stands out to you about the scenario? What might you do or say in this situation? And what's wrong with this situation? I think. Yeah, oh Dallas, there's victim blaming taking place. Absolutely. Yeah, they already don't believe the survivor, and the investigation has barely started. Absolutely. Thanks for highlighting that. Yeah, Heike says, explain me that as a victim advocate, I'm entering any situation without any bias and preconceived beliefs. All right. Yeah, explaining that, to be clear, explaining that directly to the detention staff. Yeah. Heather, almost everything is wrong with the situation. Absolutely. They don't believe the victim, being so vocal about it. I'm here for the survivor's needs and will try to be as timely as possible. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I do want to highlight, like, Layla talked a little bit about knowing when to push and when to back off. And I will say that depending on the detention staff's body language and their energy, this may be something where you kind of just like deflect and like focus on the survivor. If you engage in that conversation and say, like, I'm a victim advocate and I'm here to just believe the survivor, like, and kind of blow them off, it could make things a little bit worse for you and for the survivor. So it might be something where you kind of just focus your energy on supporting the survivor at that moment and almost like ignore them. It just depends on the situation, of course, but it could stoke the fire a tiny bit if this person is already having this mindset. Yeah, anything else? Okay, well, if people are having some finishing thoughts on that, we'll go to scenario number 3. Okay, during the forensic exam, the survivor asks several times what's going to happen next and seems to be anxious. After the exam, they ask you for multiple legal resources, ask if you can call their lawyer, and begs you to come visit them for counseling the very next day the very next day. They also want to know what's going to happen with the perpetrator. You can see the survivors feeling overwhelmed and scared. What might you do in this situation? What are some key things to keep in mind about what the survivor might be experiencing and how, well, I'll pause there. There, okay. I would try to talk with them alone in case the perpetrator's in the room with us. Okay, yeah, trying to advocate for as much confidentiality as possible. Sure. One of the things that strikes me about this scenario is, asking for multiple things, asking for a lot of things. And I think sometimes it's hard for us to remember that incarcerated survivors don't often interact with folks that are advocates, that are being really respectful in their conversation and being really helpful and supportive. And they might want to, they're desperate for resources because there's such little resources and there's so few options for them. So they're meeting someone who's respectful and kind, and they're like, oh, please help me with all of these things that I need help on. And so really wanting to keep that in mind. Okay, Heather, I see. I will do my best to assure them that they do not have to face the perpetrator anytime soon. even if it does not proceed to court, and myself as a victim services advocate can be with them when that happens. Give them a more realistic timeline. It will be months at least before we see a courtroom, if ever. Remind them that we can figure out and work through any issues one step at a time. We will be there to help support. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that, Heather. I think too, because we're talking about incarcerated survivors here, maybe thinking about, they have a lot, they have a lack of autonomy over where they go, what they do next, right? They don't have a lot of control over whether or not they're going to be able to see the perpetrator. And detention facilities don't have a great track record of making sure that folks are separated. So maybe thinking about some creative safety planning and what that looks like. Talking to them about what their support system does look like, who on the inside is someone that's supportive to you, as someone that would be a safe person for you to talk to, and someone who can, watch out for you, or someone that can, yeah, I mean, you have to get kind of creative and lean on their expertise in their day-to-day when you're talking about safety planning. And then the CSC says, reassure them that I will do my best to stay in touch on a regular basis to keep them up to date with any new information on the case, letting them know that if the DA picks up charges, I will follow the criminal case. Yeah, letting them know. I love that you're kind of leaving it open, but not saying, okay, I'm going to call you tomorrow. And saying that you'll do your best to keep touching base with them on a regular basis, and being really realistic on information that you can share, assuming that you also have an ROI and whatnot. Okay, beautiful. I know we're a little bit over time, so I'm going to speed us into our thank yous. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And want to thank everybody for their patience as we navigated our technical difficulties earlier. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, please let us know. I'm going to put my email in the chat, and I hope Layla does as well. And then I'm also going to, yes, so Claire, yes, we are recording the session. So what we do is we'll put it on the Valor website, and then it goes out in our newsletter. And I'm taking all of your emails, and well, yes, it'll be sent out essentially. The short version of that is, yes, the slides and the recording will be sent out probably tomorrow or Thursday. So we will get a copy of that. Beautiful. And then I'm supposed to have a survey link available, but I'm going to email it out to folks too. So if you're able to do that survey, super, super helpful. It helps us know what you'd love to see more of, less of, all of the above. But yeah, thank you everybody for your time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.
Bye, folks. Recording.